All right, everyone. So today I wanted to share with you guys some important information when it comes to progressing through the Dragon Dungeon. So if you're stuck anywhere in the Dragon Dungeon, anywhere up to stage 20, of course, this video should hopefully help you out. So let's go ahead and get right to it and start off with, first of all, the mechanics of the actual dragon himself. So you've got those two trash waves at the start, of course, really important because this is going to be a big time sink as well. Don't worry too much about the time, though, when you're still in the actual progression part. That's something you can always focus on later. It's going to take a while to get through those trash waves, most likely, but you know, as long as you can get through them and get to the actual boss, that's all you really have to worry about to start. Then, of course, you've got his strong debuffs, and I'll actually show you guys some images here of exactly the skill kit that the dragon actually has. He also has some strong crowd control immunities as well, and the most important thing, which is why I have it double starred there at the bottom, is his really high burst damage skill that he does called Scorch if you don't actually burn through his shield that he puts up. And this is kind of like the main component around the actual dragon encounter that you really have to work around. So I'll talk about some strategies and kind of ways on how you can handle this if this is the actual part of the encounter that is giving you the difficulties. And of course I'll talk about all the other stuff as well that might be giving you difficulties. But just a quick overview here of his actual skill kit, including those debuffs. Let's see here. So he's got that almighty immunity, immune to stun, freeze, sleep, provoke, block cooldown skills, fear, and true fear debuffs. Also immune to HP exchange effects, HP balancing effects, and cooldown increasing effects. Then you've got his Scorch here. Attacks all enemies, places a stun debuff for 1 turn, so that's just another debuff added to that mix right there. This skill will be locked and hidden again if the dragon takes enough damage while the skill is unlocked. So again, this is like the main encounter, the main thing around this guy that you really have to figure out how to work around. And there are multiple ways to work around it, but you have to make sure that you stick to one of them, and that's kind of going to be the game plan of your team formation. And let's see here. We've got Inhale, fully depletes the target's turn meter, unlocks a secret skill, which is that Scorch. And here you actually have what the Scorch looks like, so you can see that purple section up top there. That's going to be that shield that you have to actually break through, and if you don't break through it, then he's going to do a lot of damage to your team. And if you do break through it, then obviously don't have to worry about taking all of that damage. Then you've got Wall of Fire here. Attacks all enemies, places 2 5% poison debuffs for 3 turns, places a 25% weaken debuff for 2 turns. So those are more of those debuffs that kind of have to figure out what to do. If you're going to have a way to cleanse those, remove them, become immune to them, it's just another little thing that you have to add to your checklist of you know, what you need for your actual team formation. And he's got his Swipe, which is attacks all enemies, places a 50% decrease attack debuff for 2 turns. So now you know the actual skill kit and what's involved here. Let's get into kind of how to tackle this fight a little bit better. So the first thing right here, really important, of course, is are you okay with the actual trash waves? And this is obviously something you have to ask first, not only because you technically go through the trash waves before you actually get to the boss, but generally the trash waves are going to be considered easier, not necessarily quicker by any means, but easier. So if you still feel, if you're at the point where like a good part of your team is dying to the trash waves, then that's a pretty darn good indicator that you're going to struggle with the boss as well. So once again, as I mentioned at the start, don't really worry too much about the time optimization. When you're progressing, you can always go back, and when you finish the progression part, you can go and work on the time to get your farm speeds quicker, but make sure that you're able to stay alive, and you kind of have a game plan of what your team's going to go through to make sure that they can do that consistently. All right, now let's talk a bit about that Scorch strategy. So what is going to be your way to actually handle that Scorch strategy? And there's 2 of them, and one of them I would say is a bit more end game. You really kind of have to, you know, have a much better team to work around it. But first of all, the obvious one is to just burst DPS it down. You know, keep in mind if you're progressing through and it's just something that you want to do, you know, maybe you're getting past an affinity that you're weak on. If you need to manual through this part, that's totally fine if you don't really feel like you're going to go back through and run that stage again. Like if it's a weak affinity and you don't have the champions to really farm it, but you just need to progress past it in order to get to the next stage, that's totally fine. But for most situations, when it comes to being able to burst it down, you probably want to be able to auto it and get through that shield, because obviously, you know, later on you'll want to come back and farm it and not have to worry about needing certain skills to not have their cooldowns go off and, you know, do all that sort of stuff. So just something to be mindful of, because it does open up that option of manualing it if it is a weak affinity and you don't plan on going back there. But that's obviously the, you know, probably the more commonly known strategy there. Now, the other one, though, is to actually not burst through his shield and to just soak it. And essentially what you're doing here is you're having a much more survivability, you know, heal focused team, you know, like a tanky team, instead of a team that's really particularly focusing on damage. Now, while this is an option here, it's also a bit more advanced. And keep in mind that this is also probably the worst option for farming, because it's going to be a lot more difficult to optimize your farm speed if your main strategy is to just not do as much DPS. You know, makes sense, right? But it is a way to handle it if you have like a roster, you know, depending on the champions that you've pulled. You have just a ton of really tanky, survivable champions, but you don't have like the DPS type champions to work through that shield. It's another way that you can't handle it. The most important thing, though, is don't mix these two up. Don't combine these strategies. Really bad idea. I've been there before, and it's just going to lead to a mess. It's going to make your progression a lot more difficult. So, you know, no matter which one you kind of go through, just stick to one of them and kind of make sure that your team revolves around the correct strategy to handle his Scorch. So that's the big thing right there, but you know, the dragon's got some other stuff that you kind of have to work around as well, including his debuffs. So what is going to be your strategy for the debuffs? Kind of similar to the Scorch as well, is are you going to soak them and just kind of like build a team that can handle having those debuffs up, which again is like the soak strategy for the Scorch, a bit more advanced, going to require probably better gear, or are you going to find a way to be able to cleanse them and get rid of them and do that sort of stuff? Just make sure that you don't mix these two up and do anything too crazy. It's very important through all these strategies to kind of make sure that your team synergizes really, really well, and you kind of have a game plan of how you're able to handle this stuff. And another thing here is the debuffs, the Scorch, those are kind of the big mechanics around the actual boss himself that you have to worry about. But it's also important to make sure that you are bringing champions to your actual group that are able to fill their roles properly. So you have to keep in mind the debuffs, you have to keep in mind to Scorch, the trash waves, and what is each of your team members actually doing to help contribute to handling those goals. Are they actually contributing properly, or are they just kind of taking up a spot and not really doing a whole lot? This is really important. It's very easy to realize, you know, hey, this champion that I have in my group, it's not really doing that much. Do I really need this guy in my group? And just kind of asking yourself that question, going back and spending some time going through, might actually help you, you know, replace a couple champions and really make it a lot easier to progress through here. Now, the important thing that I have starred at the bottom, very, very important with weak hits. You can have champions that have very crucial debuffs that they are applying to the actual boss. However, if they are a weak affinity, not always, but I believe it's 25 or 35% of the time, it might be 30%. Either way, around a third of the time or so, they're going to land a weak hit. And this is RNG based. So if you get unlucky and they land, like the champions that you have that have their crucial roles that they need to be applying to the actual dragon, if they are constantly landing their weak hits, they're not going to be able to apply their crucial debuffs, and that's obviously going to probably cause you to fail. So, you know, in that case, you either have to redo it, you have to manual it, you have to, you know, work around that by either switching out those champions. And generally, I would say if this is a stage where you don't plan on farming a lot, it's okay if it's going to take you a couple attempts to move past it. Like if you move from a weak affinity stage to the next one is a strong affinity, and that's going to be the one that you stay at for a while, totally okay if it takes you a couple of times. But, you know, if this is something that you plan on farming for a while, obviously you don't want to have to rely on RNG with your weak hits. And you know, if that's going to cause you to fail a good amount of the time, that's going to be a big problem right there. Alright, and then of course, another important thing is the survivability of your champions. And this is key. I put this obviously way before damage because this is all about progression. It's not about optimizing your farm speed. You can always do that later on, and none of your champions are going to be useful if they are dead. So another thing about survivability is lean towards champions that you can increase their survivability without compromising an equal amount of DPS. Now, I say it that way because in most cases, you're always going to lose some DPS when it comes to survivability, not always the case. Like if you have HP or defense-based champions that have a really good skill kit, you can actually completely knock out two birds with one stone. But you know, in a lot of cases, in one way, shape, or another, you're going to compromise at least some DPS for survivability. But what you want to do is you want to lean towards champions where you can increase their survivability a lot without decreasing their DPS a lot. So, you know, if you have like a purely attack-based champion and they've got, you know, 10 points of survivability and 10 points of damage, and you need to increase their survivability, you're going to go down from 10 points of damage to 5 points of damage and increase their survivability from 10 points to 15. So it's like you swap out 1 point of survivability for 1 point of damage. Whereas if you have champions that have really good defensive or HP-based skill kits, now, you know, if they go down from 10 points of damage down to just 8 points of damage, you can swap out 2 points of damage for 5 points of survivability. So just kind of an example of a way to think about it is, you know, always focus around champions that work that way. Just to give you a little bit of an example here, you've got those HP-based champions, those defense-based champions, but also poisoners. Poisoners are a great example of what I just said right now, because their poison does not actually, like, the poison doesn't increase based off of their attack. It's just going to be based off of the boss's HP. So, you know, you've got champions like Frozen Banshee here, who is actually fantastic specifically for the dragon and the clan boss, where you could actually just build her skill kit. Even though she's an attack-based champion, you don't really need the actual damage on her ability here. It's not that important. You're going to get most of her damage from the actual poisons, right? So what you could do is you can lower her attack a ton and increase her survivability a ton, and that way you're getting her to be really tanky and survive, but because most of your damage is coming from the poisons, it doesn't really matter a whole lot that you're taking away points of attack. So just an example right there. And of course, the last thing here that I want to bring up is role optimization. Very important, especially as you really get to the later stages, is can you fill the crucial roles in your formation better? Like, you're going to need certain buffs, you're going to need certain debuffs, increase attack, increase defense, decrease attack, decrease defense. Those are the important ones right there. And is there any way that you can you know, combine the roles that your champions are filling and free up champion slots so that they can do other things? You know, maybe you can bring in another survivability utility type champion. Maybe you can bring in more DPS. Is there any way you can do that with your roster? And just a great example here, a good example of a rare champion that's even farmable is like a champion like Spirit Host. So just to take a look at her actual skill kit right here. So, you know, good example for the dragon is because, first of all, she's got that increased attack on her second ability. Strong version on all allies, 3-turn cooldown, pretty solid buff. But then she also has that cleanse, which could be really useful for all those debuffs that the dragon is going to be placing, right? Removes all debuffs on all allies, places a block debuffs buff on all allies for 1 turn. And on top of that, she's also got a speed aura if you need to take advantage of that. So you're really just finding ways in this step here to combine all the things that you really need in order to conquer the dragon, and see if there's any ways you can consolidate and free up spots for you know, more survivability and DPS that's going to make it easier for you. So anyway, there's a lot more that I could talk about this, but I'm just going to leave it here because we're already at about 13 minutes. So, you know, maybe part 2, maybe part 3 coming in the future, maybe for other dungeons. Let me know how you guys felt about this video and if you enjoyed it. And if you did, consider subscribing to the channel. Really do appreciate all the support. Feel free to leave a quick like as well. It means more than you can imagine. So thank you so much to all of you guys who do that. And more Raid Shadow Legends videos, guides, tutorials, all that fun stuff should be popping up on the screen right about now. Feel free to check them out. But if not, until next time, take care, everyone. This is Salt of the Salty Guild, signing out.